making stuff more efficiently it basically creates wealth, and that wealth does not necessarily get distributed evenly. AI is fundamentally different, and if you can hire, a computer to do everything that person can do more cheaply, then you don't ever need to hire a person to do anything again.
Hello, my friends. This is Christina Mandlakiani, co-founder of Mind Valley and a host of Mind Valley Book Club. And somehow, as we were going live and Masha said, I'll send you live in 6 seconds, I suddenly got so excited. I realized that I actually enjoy these interviews. So thank you guys for joining me, for coming to my interviews. As I said a few weeks ago, this is probably the highlight of our week for Mind Valley Book Club, because as you know, an absolute ultimate goal for us for our work is to pick a book of the year every single year, because we think that book publishing, especially self-help or non-fiction, is such a tough process with hardly any celebration. So we want to celebrate the best new books in personal growth and business. So thank you guys for coming, because this all little by little contributes to this ultimate goal of celebrating great books. And today I have a very unusual book, I must say, in many ways. I know that I have my own biases towards the books that I pick, but I also see a lot of books on a weekly basis. So it is unusual in the grand scale. It's not the topic that you come across often. And my guest today is Brian Potter. Hi, Brian. Welcome to Mind Valley.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Today we are discussing Brian's book, but first a little intro. Brian is a writer, a great writer, by the way, and an engineer by education and by passion. Obviously, has spent over 15 years, I believe, in construction engineering. I might be slightly wrong with that, focusing on efficiency and, improving efficiency of these processes. And Brian's book, The Origins of Efficiency, in fact, talks about these processes in detail, and we'll go deeper into that. But Brian, do add, please, if there are any important parts about your bio which I didn't find, it is important to mention right now.
Yeah, you had it right. My background is actually specifically in the construction industry. I worked as what's called a structural engineer, which is the person who designs buildings and, apartment complexes and water treatment plants and makes sure they stand up, basically. The architect designs what they look like, and the engineer makes sure that the building stands up. So that's what my engineering background is, specifically in construction and design in buildings.
Yes, structural engineering was the word that I forgot, but actually, also judging by the book, I think you have pretty good depth in history as well, because that was very fascinating. So now the book, The Origins of Efficiency, that we picked for Mind Valley Book Club as the book of the week. I have to say that this was the book where I was happy to have my team of pro readers, because, as I said, it is a very unusual book. And since I'm not an engineer, I was a little bit scared going into it, I have to say, because even the cover is, I would say, intimidating in a good way, but also, when we are reading for pleasure, sometimes we are afraid of certain topics. But I have to say, Brian, and this is like, it's probably not very deep kind of feedback, but I was so fascinated by the book. It reads it is so engaging. And I have to say that the topics, Brian does talk very deeply about productivity, how to improve its efficiency, how the improving of the efficiency of production has actually led our civilization forward. There's a very deep historical glance into how things evolved. Yes, it is about history. It is about production. It is about economics. There are charts and big words, but it is really engaging. So thank you for this book. I actually enjoyed it thoroughly.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
So yeah, as I said, this was the book where I was happy to have our pro readers who maybe have slightly different biases from me, who said, Christina, we have to invite Brian for the interview. So now to the topic of the book. And of course, there are a lot of questions I have. But first, maybe to have an easy entry into this topic, I really enjoyed the beginning idea in the beginning of your book, where you actually went into detail to explain how much time we used to spend as a humanity on producing the most simple things. And I think in the 21st century, we don't think about that, because when I read, for example, a book from Middle Ages or from ancient Greece, I never think that, the toga described on a certain character might have taken such a long time to create, and maybe that's the only piece of clothing that this person owns. Could you maybe do the same gentle start to our audience, and tell us about where did we start from as humanity?
Yeah, so yeah, I kind of go through this in the introduction to the book, how historically it just took an enormous amount of time and effort to produce anything, like any sort of physical good, anything you wanted to have to kind of make your life easier, or be able to do new things. It just took like a huge amount of time and effort to produce, and as a result, everything was basically super, super expensive. It was only existed in relatively small quantities, and everybody was basically poor because it took so much time and effort to produce things, that it was just, everything was just so expensive, and there was very, very little of it. And so you talk a little bit about cloth and thread production. For most of human history, it took like a really, 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 really long time to produce cloth and thread. You had these basically tiny little fibers that came from a plant or from an animal, sheep or something like that, and you'd have to sort of slowly spin those into an individual thread, which took a very long time. And then once you collected a huge, huge, huge amount of thread, you could stitch that together into a big sheet of cloth, and then turn that into a garment, or whatever it is that you're making. But it took hundreds and hundreds of hours to spin the thread and make the cloth to produce these garments. And so yeah, people had very, very few garments, and they were relatively quite expensive. And that was one, of course, the Industrial Revolution, which kicked off in Britain in the sort of end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. This was like the first big industry that it revolutionized, and it was why it was such a huge deal, because they figured out they could figure out ways to make all this cloth with machines, and then dramatically reduce the amount of time and effort it took to produce thread and produce cloth. And all of a sudden, the price of cloth falls by something like 95%. And of course, when something gets 95% cheaper, all of a sudden you can do a lot more things with it, because it's not so expensive. And people who couldn't afford it before now are able to have access to it. And that sort of process has just played out, basically almost anything: steel and books and drugs and whatever it is that you're talking about. It used to take a lot of time and effort to produce all those things. And as civilization has advanced, we've figured out how to sort of make this stuff more efficiently, less expensively, and which has brought access to all these sort of goods and services to sort of millions and billions of people, and is what makes living a modern life possible, is basically figuring out how to make this stuff inexpensively.
And food as well,
Yeah,
which is
food.
probably
Yeah, food's
the
another huge
closest
one.
to our. But so it is a very fascinating part of the book, really fascinating.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of, it puts things in perspective. But looking at it from our current day, where we have access to a lot of stuff, where we talk about people consuming more than they need, or buying more than they need, or like throwing out the food. For example, I have this little container where we throw away all the leftovers. Uh, how how is it relevant to us in our contemporary day? Because this age of abundance is very short for humanity. Do we have to look back at that and feel grateful for what we have, or is there something? I mean, how is it relevant to us today, or is it just something we have to say like, "Whew, we're done with that. Now we can finally live."
Yeah, so I think you make a good point. I think we should look at like this huge machine that civilization has produced for making these goods incredibly cheaply, and be really thankful for it, and be like amazed that I can like order some little widget, some device, and it gets made in a factory from China and gets all the way delivered to my house, and it costs like $5 or $6, something like that, and it can do all these sorts of amazing things. That's an amazing achievement that I think we should, celebrate and be thankful for. But then another, I think, big aspect of my book and kind of what I talk about is that this process of like finding ways to like make things really, really inexpensively, it's been really successful in some areas, but there's a lot of places that we haven't really figured out how to make these sorts of improvements yet. So to sort of a first approximation, if we can, for whatever kind of thing that we're talking about, if you can find a way to make it in some sort of factory and some sort of repetitive process where you can kind of make the same thing over and over again, so some sort of widget in a factory or some sort of food that gets produced on like a factory type farm, those things we've found ways to make like incredibly inexpensive, and everybody has access to like huge amounts of this stuff. But there's lots of things that we haven't quite figured out how to do that stuff yet, and those things kind of remain quite expensive and in some ways difficult to acquire. And so even though we found ways to make a lot of things really inexpensively, there's a lot of things that we really haven't figured out yet, and those things are like becoming quite important, and they're becoming more and more unaffordable to people. My background is, as I mentioned, is in the construction industry, and this is one area where we haven't really figured this out yet. It doesn't, my research on construction productivity is something I spend a lot of my time on, and like how efficiently we can build buildings, and something that you see especially in the US but kind of around the world as well is that we never really find ways to build buildings cheaper. It just kind of constantly gets more and more expensive, or like relatively similar amount of time and effort to make this stuff. And sort of as a result of that, it's still quite expensive to build houses and buildings and things like that. It's still a very substantial investment. It's hard for people to acquire these these houses, and there's constant worry about housing shortages, and people can't afford their new houses and things like that. And so I think we should look back at what we've achieved and marvel at it and be thankful for it, but we should also try to be thinking about how we can take these lessons and these successes that we've had and apply them to all these other areas that we don't really have abundance yet. We still have not enough housing and not enough medical care and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So there are two avenues that we could take in this interview, because on one side, this book is really a great source for people, for entrepreneurs, for example. And even I really love how you explain how production processes work, not just for the traditional old-fashioned production, like you talk about light bulbs and nails and all sorts of cars, obviously, and a lot of things. But it also is relevant to the so-called service industries. So as an entrepreneur, I can see that this book has so much value to go into these processes of finding, how to make it more efficient, how to produce more, how to be, how to build it of scale. But then the other avenue, which is more related to us as a society, as a humanity, our social issues. So with that preamble, I want to ask, who did you write this book for?
Yeah, so it's interesting. For better or for worse, I spend my full time writing and researching things, and I'm almost always first and foremost just writing for myself. I come across some topic, and I feel like I don't understand it, and I want to understand it better. I want to understand the history of it. I want to understand how it works and how the parts and pieces kind of fit together. And for me, the way that I do that is I just, I try to like just, collect all the information about it and sort of try to synthesize it in some sort of coherent way. And I generate that synthesis by like writing down my thoughts about them and sort of massaging it and tweaking it and adjusting it and editing it until I have something. It's like, okay, here's how this thing works. I've worked through some sort of understanding of this issue, and the result of that process is this document that I produce. I'm always writing with the aid to sort of explain something, or with the goal to explain something to myself. And then, it's also very great and rewarding if other people find those explanations useful and helpful as well. So because they often do, I'm able to spend basically my full time writing. So I initially wrote this book, as I said, because I had a background in the construction industry. I had spent 15 years working in it. I became frustrated that we were sort of not making it any better, and that buildings remain so expensive and time consuming to produce, and we hadn't seen the sort of improvements that we had seen in manufacturing, where we find better ways to make the stuff over time, and stuff gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. If you look at the inflation adjusted cost of a car over time, it has fallen fairly substantially, or at least it did for a very long period of time. And I wanted to understand, why couldn't construction be like that? Why couldn't we find better and cheaper ways to build buildings over time and make housing more and more affordable for people? And so I I write a newsletter called Construction Physics, which started out as me trying to work through these problems and understand these issues. But I eventually kind of concluded that, well, to understand what is so difficult about construction and why we can't build buildings more efficiently and build them for more inexpensively, I need to understand what is happening when some process does get more efficient, and when are improving productivity in some industry for a long period of time. And so the purpose of the book was for me to kind of work through my understanding of how that had happened in so many different industries, right? In manufacturing and agriculture and drug production and all these sorts of things. How had they sort of managed to do it, and how could I synthesize and stitch all those lessons together into sort of one more simple idea that could fit inside my head, basically. And so I hope lots of people will take value from the book. People, like you said, people interested in just the history of how we've learned how to make things, and business people and entrepreneurs and economists who kind of want to better understand how these parts and pieces fit together. But yeah, for first and foremost, I'm always writing for myself.
That's actually great. I have to also add to that yes, you do touch upon a lot of very complex topics in this book. So for those of you who are going to read the book, or are thinking of planning, but the beautiful thing is that it comes alive with all the stories, with our history in the mix, and with very steady pace. So as you say, you want to make it clear to yourself. It is amazing to have a book which goes into nuances of very complex process of production efficiency, but it is nevertheless understandable to a person like myself, who is not an engineer at all, not even
Well,
close.
yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, that's for me. For me to understand it, I really need the explanation to be as simple as possible. Otherwise, I won't get it.
Well, yeah, they say that you have to understand something thoroughly to be able to explain it to someone else. So, with that said, of course, you do mention some industries which, despite a good early start, actually didn't enjoy the same level of efficiency improvement as, say, food production or fabric production. And you mentioned, I was also fascinated by them. The space exploration, because this has been on my mind completely independently of any books, but I've been bothered by the fact that we haven't been able to go deep into space, but also more close to home, the education, the medical industry. As a woman, I can say that developments in femtech are literally medieval. So I know you don't mention it there, but aren't some of those topics a little bit politicized? And do you see any influence of social like values, or I don't know, perceptions of how things have to be? Do they impact the production process or the efficiency, improvement of efficiency, or is it all just technical? Whoever is running the process can make it go this way or that way.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I would say I feel like the fact that, for a lot of these areas where we haven't found them to ways to make them more efficient, I think that fact is what in some ways makes them so political is because they're so expensive. We end up in these questions of like how much of our resources should we allocate to these things? How should we decide who gets what, and who doesn't? How should we sort of help out the people that can't afford to kind of get these things? And is that a worthwhile thing to be spending our time and effort on? So, things like healthcare and things like housing and things like education, I think in some ways are political is because we haven't found them ways to make them like, cheap and inexpensive. If they were cheap and expensive to get all these things, it would not be so political because we could just give, a large amount to everyone and it would not be so much of a problem. You don't see these strong political questions about like food production really because in the US at least, thankfully, everybody is wealthy enough that even the quite poor people that almost everybody has basically enough to eat. It doesn't really impinge on the political questions of like distribution and how you decide who gets what. But for these other kind of things that are like much more expensive, the question becomes kind of much more important and much more difficult to answer. So I kind of think that, yeah, it impinges the question of efficiency, touches on these sort of areas in the way that it sort of is driving the sort of political questions about them.
So, wouldn't it be fair to say that sometimes our urgent needs may improve our ability to be efficient? For example, you do start the book with penicillin, which is such a also interesting topic, but the discovery and the evolution of this came at a time where it was very important for us because it was the wartime. People were getting injured, and as you say in the book, historically, the the wounds killed people more because of them inflaming than because of the actual like enemy killing a person. So do we as humans, are we capable of actually solving problems very, very urgent, very efficiently if we realize that this is a question of life and death?
Yeah, I think penicillin is a really good answer and yeah, a really good example. And yeah, I do agree that in general, if people see this as like a quite urgent problem and are able to like bring their resources and creativity to bear on it, there are you are ultimately able to sort of solve these problems and figure out important ways of reducing costs and improving efficiency and making stuff better in ways that maybe you aren't if it doesn't seem quite so urgent. So there's high level people that worked on the penicillin program have basically said that if it were not for like the war and the urgency and the government action to sort of stimulate the invention and sort of the being able to find ways to make this stuff in the very large volumes that the armed forces needed, we might not have gotten it, or at least not have gotten it as early as we did, because there were so many like these difficult technical problems that needed to sort of be solved. So it was definitely like the wartime urgency that drove those sorts of developments. And yeah, I think that's a question. It's like, how do you sort of cultivate that sense of urgency and sort of these other problems, which maybe otherwise people are not necessarily super driven to find answers to.
So I'm sorry to be stuck to this aspect of your book, but I just find it so such an important discussion. Another thing I wanted to ask you. I kind of get the case for the improving efficiency and producing more, but there's also the idea that the more we evolve technologically, for example, the bigger the gap is created between the so-called rich countries. I'm currently not politically very correct, but between the rich countries and let's say the poorer, more marginalized groups. So since you've looked into history quite deep, does this gap really like increase the more we evolve as a civilization, or are we capable of lifting everyone together with those who benefit the most from evolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess my answer would be two parts. Is that one is that finding ways to sort of produce this stuff more inexpensively tends to benefit everybody. It may benefit some people more because they end up, running successful businesses or getting rich or whatever more than like the very poorest. But like everybody in the world benefits from it being, cheap to produce cloth and cheap to produce food and cheap to produce penicillin and drugs and stuff like that, right? Like having those things, more inexpensive and more widely available basically benefits everybody. Everybody's, the global life expectancy and things like that have like steadily risen over time. A person, no matter where you are in the world today, you're almost certainly going to live a longer and richer life than you would have 300, 400, 500 years ago. And it's because in large part, because we've found ways to sort of produce the things that make life worth living, better and less expensively. And another big part of that is sort of this drive to improved efficiency has historically been a kind of important way that countries have managed to get themselves richer. So, people are always trying to find ways to sort of make whatever it is they're making for as inexpensively as possible. Historically, a big part of that was just the labor cost, the cost of like paying someone to, manufacture whatever thing you're doing or produce whatever it is that you're making. And historically, what a lot of manufacturers done is they've tried to find countries with like very inexpensive labor, and go set up some operation there, go set up a factory in China or Taiwan or Korea or whatever, and to sort of make this stuff cheaper. But as they've done that, that process has served to help these countries get richer over time. So China is a much richer country today, than it was 30, 40 years ago, because in large part because so many companies wanted to go over there and set up these factories and take advantage of their low cost labor. And that process is kind of what helped to make China much richer and again, help the people that are living in those countries live better and longer lives. So I think, there's definitely a question of is this, as making stuff more efficiently it basically creates wealth, and that wealth does not necessarily get distributed evenly. I think that is certainly true, but it's also true that this process is also what helps poor countries get richer, and it helps everybody kind of live longer and better lives as well.
So I'm going to, of course, ask the question which I have to ask, although I know that in the book you do touch upon this point a little bit. There is also this. Okay, maybe I'll make a step back, and there's no argument that all the technological advancements and improvements and whatever we've discovered as a civilization have improved our lifestyle, at least until the 20th century, at least when we started living longer and we are not starving anymore and not dying from preventable diseases. However, right now there's a huge pushback because another obvious reality is that we do consume not a little, quite considerably more than we need. We produce more than we need. Marketing is driving this whole need to get the newest gadgets, to replace perfectly functional old gadgets. As I was reading about how hard it was to produce cloth and how long it would take, for example, to produce a sail for a Viking ship, it hit me that in the old days people were fixing things for no other reason that it just was so much more reasonable to fix the thing rather than toss it away. So is there a limit to how much we should improve efficiency and production, or is this happening for another reason and there is some other force at play which actually takes a good process and turns it against us?
That's a good question. I think it's definitely true that we as a civilization figure out how to solve problems, in some ways we can often create for ourselves new problems. There's this concept of diseases of civilization, right? Where these things that happen to people because we've created this world where we solve so many problems and created this world of abundance. So, things causes of, overeating and people being, too overweight because we have so much food in such huge volumes that it's very easy for people to eat too much, in a way that when food was extremely scarce and it was hard for people to get enough to eat, that wasn't so much of a problem anymore. So I think it's definitely true that as you sort of solve these problems of like finding ways to produce stuff more cheaply and making it wider available to people, you then have to sort of cope with the fact that this is going to kind of create some new issues as well. I don't think that means we shouldn't find ways to do it, other than, the same way I don't think the fact that some people become overweight and eat too much means that we should find ways to like not make, find ways to make food more expensive, or, not make so much of it, or whatever. But I do agree that we need to kind of be like cognizant of the role that this is playing in our society and think about what it would maybe mean to address that.
You do mention in the book that some of that improving efficiency could help us solve our environmental problems. Yet that's one of the big arguments against production, is that we have actually destroyed our planet by trying to produce more and more and more. I didn't read that sentiment actually from your book. I was a little bit curious about, which way you're going to take it.
So yeah, I guess my sort of a little bit tricky way of answering that is I think problems like that, or problems of overproduction, or problems of like, yeah, too much efficiency, often what that is, sort of similar to how we've like made, some things more efficient, but other things we haven't. Problems of too much efficiency is often thing where we haven't been able to spread those ideas far enough, and we haven't made enough of the right things inexpensive. So I guess an example of that, we're right, a big problem that we have right now regarding too much production and too much consumption is climate change and dumping huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the air, which is causing global warming and changing the climate and things like that, which is a big problem. I agree. But one way of thinking about that as a problem is that it's just very expensive and difficult to sort of pull carbon dioxide out of the air, or alternatively, it has been too expensive to produce energy in ways that didn't generate carbon dioxide. So if it was really cheap to pull carbon dioxide out of the air, the problem of like burning too many fossil fuels wouldn't really be a problem. If it was like really cheap and easy, which it's getting there, but not quite all the way, to generate electricity and energy, using solar energy and wind, and not with burning fossil fuels, again, this problem of like overproduction wouldn't really be, and burning too many hydrocarbons would not really be a problem. So in a lot of cases, the way that I think about it is just these problems of like overconsumption and problems of too much efficiency is really cases where we haven't figured out how to sort of make enough things cheap, such that we haven't figured out how to use cheapness to solve the problems that this thing creates.
It's actually such an interesting thought, and I think it's quite nuanced to grasp it. But I'll try to rephrase and ask if that's what you're thinking. Like if we were equally efficient in different areas of let's say our life and production, then these problems wouldn't exist, because then we create these problems because in some areas we are not as efficient as in other areas.
Yeah, that's basically what I mean. It's not every single problem is not like that. As you mentioned, you
Yeah.
have these sort of diseases of civilization, but a lot of them, I think you can kind of think about it in those terms, and think about it in terms of some new thing that you need to figure out how to make cheap, basically.
Well, I would say that if we could fix the education, I thought we had fixed it. I mean, the literacy rates have gone up, but you do mention it as one of the examples. Now, I do want to ask that, and for those of you who haven't read the book and are curious, the book actually goes in a lot of technical detail about the processes of production and how to improve efficiency and how to what will happen. I probably wouldn't do it justice because I'm only retelling what I read. But I do want to ask that question here, because we're not going into detail about these processes. If you want to go deeper, get the book, read it. Actually, if you have a book, could you show it to us so that we...
Yeah, I have it right here. It's Origins of Efficiency.
Yeah,
Um,
beautiful
yeah,
cover.
yeah,
I like
nice,
this
yeah,
cover.
nicely designed cover.
Yeah.
Getting the cover to, deciding on the cover was a long and involved process, but it ended up turning out quite nice. So
So the question from that category, though, that I want to ask, so what happens? Why is it that certain areas we just can't seem to move on? Like penicillin took quite a long time, but still we moved very, very quickly because the numbers of how much more we produce now versus when it was just discovered are just mind blowing. It's thousands, right? Or tens of thousands
yeah,
times more
some
efficient.
some huge number.
Yet, when we take, again, I will take less political topic of, let's say, space exploration. Humans allegedly, and I believe that we did land on the moon in the 60s, and here we are in like how many years? Very quick calculation. 60 years later, we're still haven't repeated it. So, what happens? Where does this efficiency drop or disappear? And for those of you who haven't read the book, it's actually quite nuanced. Like it's not just input output and the black box in the middle. There is quite a lot of nuance to this process.
Yeah, so I would say to a first kind of approximation, the sort of things that have gotten more efficient, have gotten cheap, are things that we can find some like really repetitive process that you can like build a machine or an arrangement of people that acts like a machine to do over and over and over again. So you things like some sort of machine or some sort of factory that produces some like widget over and over again. You think of like agriculture or farming equipment that like can process huge amounts of crops just by using these like repetitive mechanical motions. Those are the things that have gotten cheap. The things that remain expensive are the things that you're encountering so many different and unique situations to sort of produce it or to solve these sort of problems or to provide the services, that you need a person in there who has expertise, who can respond basically based on what the specific situation of that that is demanded on it and that specific particular time. So I'll give an example that I think that illustrates it really nicely. Is that manufacturing cars, as I mentioned earlier, it's gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time. Cars have gotten quite expensive, but they also have like lots of new features and stuff like that. And if you look like the inflation adjusted cost of a car, it's gotten steadily cheaper over time. And because we can make these things in these factories and produce this like step-by-step process where it does the same thing over and over again. But if you look at the cost of car repair, of fixing a car, it has not gotten cheaper over time. It basically rises with the level of overall inflation, or perhaps slightly above it. And the reason is because for a car repair, it's much harder to do that sort of repetitive process that you do over and over and over again. If somebody brings in their car to a mechanic and they're like, hey, this thing is not working, it's making a weird sound, the guy, you need somebody there that can like go into the car and figure out exactly what's wrong with it, figure out how to disassemble it, put it back together to sort of fix the widget. It might be broken in sort of any number of different ways, and so you need this person, this expert, and to sort of go in there and figure out what needs to be done. And they can only work at like the speed that a person can work, right? They can't work at like some really, really fast, at the rate of some really, really fast machine or something like that. And that's kind of the difference between the things that have gotten cheap and the things that have gotten expensive. The things that have things that have stayed expensive. The things that have stayed expensive are the ones where we have that like some person or some group of people in there that need to sort of figure out what it needs to be done, and that expertise and that time it takes for them to sort of figure it out and work through it often makes stuff quite expensive.
So human touch is still of huge value, even in the processes of production, efficiency improvement, and scale. And
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's still and it's still, again, that's still quite important. Quite a a very, very large fraction of goods and services that people consume are as these sort of high touch expert areas. And that's what is, maybe so interesting about, we haven't talked at all about, artificial intelligence, the AI that huge amounts of money are going and being invested in. And that's something that could like really change this. Because if you have like an AI that can sort of figure this stuff out, but maybe much quicker and much more inexpensively than an expensive expert can do, then all these things that historically required like expensive human services to provide, maybe all of a sudden these things can now get cheaper as well. And of course, that raises, as you've talked about, that raises lots of other social questions. Is this going to automate away all labor and stuff like that? How are people going to survive if there's no jobs and things like that, which I think are important, very important questions as well. But you can kind of see the beginnings of maybe some of these things starting to happen.
So I now that you've mentioned AI, although I have to warn you guys, it isn't in the book as far as I have noticed. Maybe it's in a veiled form, but there is a question immediately. So the question comes from Alex. What are the potential positive and negative effects of AI efficiency improvements on human creativity and fulfillment? And I'll probably add to this question. Thank you, Alex, for asking it, because I was obviously, as I was reading the book, I was thinking, is one of the themes in your books is just because we have technology doesn't mean we'll be more efficient or produce more, or that this evolution will happen. Now, these new technologies of the past, say, 10 years, not just AI, but generally, is it any different compared to what you've seen in the history of humankind? Or is it just on a bigger scale, but pretty much the same processes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll answer the first, Alex's question first, then I'll touch on yours. Yeah, I think that some of the positive impacts of it, or stuff like AI, is that it really makes it possible to sort of do things and sort of create a vision that maybe you had in your head that maybe would have been too difficult to kind of create otherwise. So something that is really something that I use AI a lot for in my work is writing software, writing like, programs or whatever. Because I'm not a programmer. I don't really know anything about programming. So for a lot of like questions that I would be interested in answering, and if it required some like large amount of data processing or stuff like that, it just wouldn't be feasible for me to answer these sorts of things. But now that I have AI, I can say, go to the AI and say, hey, write a program that does this thing and, processes this huge amount of data or whatever. And now it can do it. And so now the sort of scope of questions that I can answer and the sort of breadth of research that I can engage in is now a lot wider because I have these tools that can do things that I just wouldn't have been able to sort of do before. I think the downside, the risk is if you let it do the things that do create value and do sort of are important for you to kind of do. So I talked about I use AI to sort of do these programming things because if I didn't have the AI, I just wouldn't do those things and I wouldn't answer those questions. But I don't use the AI to write for me. I always do the actual writing myself. But it would be very easy to sort of try to get the AI to kind of do it for me. But then I wouldn't learn if I didn't sort of go through the process of writing it myself. So I think, there's the value in basis sort of extending your capabilities. Like, a hammer makes it possible to do things that you couldn't do before. But it's can also sort of take away the sort of things that are important to cultivate in yourself as well. So I think those are some of the sort of positive and negative aspects.
As you were answering this question, I was thinking of all the millions of spinners of the old days before the Industrial Revolution. And I was thinking to myself, I have sheep, but I have no idea how to make thread out of the wool. And we like shear them twice a year. I only have theoretical knowledge of that. So this is the one skill which a lot of women used to have. Now we don't have. And I'm sure we could go into that topic. What I was asking is in your book, you say that just because we have technology doesn't necessarily mean that there will be improved productivity or will produce more and it will be more accessible. it's not necessarily connected. Now we have a lot of technological advancements happening in the past several decades. Are these changes very drastically different from what we as a humanity have seen in the previous centuries? Or is it just on this, like on a
Oh,
much
yeah.
bigger scale, but essentially the same processes?
Yeah, I remember now. So I think it's not yet clear. I think there's kind of two schools of thought on this question. The one is that it's like, AI or whatever, it's just going to be like other major automation. We've been automating, human labor for, hundreds of, thousands of years or whatever. And what has historically happened is that we automate some series of tasks away. And those people who would have formerly been working in this area, they go and find new and valuable things to do, basically. So an example of this is in the US, even as late as like the late 1800s, something like 60% of people were working on farms, basically, growing crops and, animal husbandry and raising animals and things like that. The percentage today is, something like 2 or 3%, or maybe even smaller. I don't remember the exact number, but it's single digits. And, you know, being automating all this farm work basically didn't just destroy all these jobs. Basically, all the people that would have worked on farms found new and productive things to do. They went and worked in manufacturing and services and all these other areas of the economy that expanded over time. And so there's one school of thought that AI will basically be like that, which is that they'll automate some large fraction of work, and the people that would have gone to work in these things that AI is now automated away will now go and just do something else that the AI can't do, or can't do is, it's worthwhile to hire a person to do. And then there's another school of thought that basically is like AI is fundamentally different. And if you can hire, a computer to do everything that a person can do more cheaply, then you don't ever need to hire a person to do anything again. And sort of the analogy here is that there used to be, tens of millions of horses in the U.S. and because that was the main way that you could get around from point A to point B. And when the car came along, it basically eliminated the need for all these horses. But horses didn't get reallocated to other horse jobs. We just had fewer horses, essentially, is what happened. And so that's the other school of thought, is that we're not going to reallocate. There's only going to be so much reallocation. Most of these jobs are just going to be eliminated, and there's not going to be more productive work for humans to do, because the AI is always going to be better at it, or always going to be a cheaper thing to use. I don't really know which one of those is true yet. It doesn't yet look like AI is going to sort of just permanently destroy huge fractions of jobs, but I wouldn't necessarily bet against that being true.
So the question is, are we going to be like farmers who got reallocated to other stuff, or like horses who just disappeared?
Yeah, exactly.
So I know that we are supposed to finish now, but a question came in, and that will be the last one from the audience that I'll voice. I just like you guys asking questions. That's why I'll extend this interview a little bit. So the question comes from Aisha. Are there early signs that someone is focusing on activity instead of meaningful progress?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, my answer would be, if you're not, the less that you're focused on sort of your ultimate goal, and the more that you're focused on, like, some sort of intermediate goal of like pursuing some particular, task, or making sure you get like something completed and not sort of keeping your eye on prize, the more maybe you're not sort of actually progressing. So I write a weekly, bi-weekly-ish newsletter, that's basically just an essay about kind of whatever it is I'm thinking about at that particular time. Often it's about like construction and productivity. Often it's about like technology, other things. It's just really kind of whatever my interests are. And my ultimate goal is like, all right, I need to have, this essay done and written by, this date or whatever needs to go out. And that's what I'm always working backwards in my mind. Like, all right, this needs to be out and released by this date, which means I need to get this task done by this day and this task done by this day, blah, blah, blah. And I sort of work backwards and work out a schedule. But it would be very easy if I wasn't focused on that ultimate goal to sort of be bogged down in sort of interim things like, oh, I made progress on this thing. I got this much written. I sort of looked up these sources or whatever, without that sort of, deadline to sort of keep me honest and force me to sort of think about what tasks are valuable and what tasks aren't, and sort of decide how I need to sort of structure my workflow to get things done. It would be very easy to get caught up in things that felt like they were making progress, but wasn't actually pushing me towards what I needed to do, which is get an essay out and up on the website and written, basically. So I think the less that you're, being guided by what your sort of ultimate goal is, and the less that is like structuring what your activities are, the easier it is to sort of have the doing things which create the sort of illusion of work but aren't actually helping you progress.
Thank you for this answer, because I think I often slip into just enjoying the process. But thank you guys for joining. I will remind you that Mind Valley Book Club, if you are not signed up, sign up. Once a week, we send out roundups of the best new releases of the previous week, and also of those books. We pick one book per week to highlight as the book of the week by Mind Valley. And then I have an opportunity to talk to the author and go deeper into the book or around the book. I prefer to go around the book because I've read the book. So today's book was The Origins of Efficiency. If you haven't gotten yet, we are probably going to share the link somewhere under the video, and I'm sure Masha can show you the link right now. Get the book. It is very thorough, very deep, very technical, but it's also very well put together in the sense that it is engaging and you will enjoy the process, even if the topics may be a little bit intimidating. So thank you, Brian, for that. I'll ask the last question, my traditional question. Oh, yes. And if you haven't signed up to Mind Valley Book Club, it is free, by the way. We do it for free, believe it or not, because we believe in making reading sexy again. So a traditional request to those of you who are watching us live, leave a heart for my guest. And if you're watching it in recording, leave a heart under the video. And my last question to Brian is, how would you like, I know you wrote it for yourself, but how would you like your book to change the world?
I would like it to be something that people who are studying business or economics in university be something that they had to sort of read to sort of encounter these ideas. Because I ended up writing this book because I felt like there was lots of like little bits of understanding that were spread around huge numbers of different sources and different pieces of research and different sort of narrow industries and things like that. But there's nothing that like tied it all together in something sort of coherent. So I would like, people who are studying these, business and economics and operations research and all those things in college and university to sort of be able to read it and encounter it and have a better go into the world with a sort of a better understanding of these ideas. And, again, hopefully help push civilization forward just a little bit.
And as an entrepreneur, I can say that if you have a business, it's also a very educating book, and because you have a somewhat different approach from my day-to-day life, it actually is really, how to say, it helps to see certain things that we sometimes get so used to seeing that we don't see. Sometimes you need a bigger picture to see finally the problem. So I think it's good for entrepreneurs as well. So if you are one of them, that book is for you as well. Thank you, Brian, so much. And I wish good luck and huge success to your book. And thank you all for joining. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.